big picture. What's happening in Sacramento?
Last week marked really one of the legislature's most important deadlines, which is House of Origin, meaning that all assembly bills had to pass the assembly and Senate bills had to pass the Senate in order to continue moving this year. So for the cannabis industry, House of Origin serves as a major sorting mechanism of the legislative session. It tells us which proposals have gained enough political, policy, and fiscal support to continue advancing and which ones haven't. I think as I reported in our last discussion, which I feel was a while ago, what we're really seeing this year is a continuation of a much broader shift in cannabis policy. So we're 10 years approaching the 10-year anniversary of the passage of Prop 64, and California really we're really no longer debating legalization. The conversation has matured. The focus today is whether the regulated market can function as the way voters intended. And so add to that, we're now having this bigger conversation against the backdrop of potential federal rescheduling. While there remains considerable uncertainty surrounding federal action, the questions are becoming increasingly practical. So how do we ensure California's regulatory framework functions as federal reforms are implemented? How do we prepare for a future where cannabis products may move across state lines? And most importantly, how do we position California operators to succeed in a more integrated national marketplace? So as a result, many of the bills we're discussing this year aren't simply about solving today's problems. They're also about preparing California's cannabis industry for what comes next. So that's really where we are and where we're focused. CaCOA has been spending much of its time working with policymakers and regulators to ensure that the rules are clear, enforceable, and focused on the high-risk conduct and not creating unnecessary burdens for operators. So that's really been my charge and continues to be my charge against this broader backdrop now, which is federal rescheduling.
Yeah. So it feels like a real watershed moment. And is CaCOA still leaning heavily into enforcement this session, or has that shifted?
So enforcement continues to be one of our biggest priorities. And that's really because we wholeheartedly believe if the legal market can't succeed, if the illegal market can't succeed if the illicit market continues. And licensed operators follow extensive rules around testing, packaging, track and trace, age verification, compliance. And yet we're still seeing an approximate 60% illicit market. In other words, 60% of cannabis sales in California still occur outside the regulated marketplace. And that's really according to the state's own analysis. So one of the things we're really doing this year is again, really trying to focus on what should be and what we believe based on input from the legislature, what should an enforcement strategy look like? And so we decided to sponsor AB 2537 by Assemblymember Phil Chen. This bill establishes a risk-based enforcement framework that really directs the DCC to prioritize violations that pose the greatest risk to public health, public safety, and market integrity. So things like contaminated products, synthetic cannabinoids, diversion, sales to minors, environmental violations. We feel all of that should be really prioritized when the DCC is thinking about how it invests its enforcement dollars and staff time. The industry is all too familiar with notices to correct, and it doesn't suggest that they can't continue to issue NTCs or conduct normal inspections, but really, we want those dollars, those limited dollars, to really focus on, again, the most egregious violations, particularly violations perpetrated by the illicit market. So we feel that would have the greatest impact, and that's really what the legislature intended. And so that's one of our primary bills. And I'm pleased to say that the bill did pass the Assembly 76-0 last Thursday. So it's now going to the Senate. And so we'll start those discussions with Senate committee and Senate members. And really, actually, those are getting kicked off this week.
Yeah, that's great. Congrats again. How does AB 1826 fit into all this?
So 1826, I would characterize as kind of a companion piece to AB 2537, though both concepts were developed separate as separate and distinct concepts. It wasn't like a package of bills that were designed to complement one another, but they really do. So if AB 2537 is about what gets enforced, AB 826 is about how enforcement occurs. The bill focuses on recall, embargo, and condemnation procedures. It creates clearer timelines, improves transparency and access to evidence, and provides opportunities for licensees to meet and confer and try to resolve issues with the DCC before products are actually destroyed. So it's a great bill. The Assembly certainly agreed because they insisted that both bills be heard on the same day to give the committee members an opportunity to really explore them or deliberate on them as a package. So that's really the distinction.
Okay. And what's the latest with packaging?
So AB 2249 has occupied a tremendous amount of time. This bill stems largely from a state auditor report. I think we covered it during the last discussion. That report, which was generated and released late last year, prompted a hearing of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee in February of this year. And that committee really examined the report in greater detail with the fundamental question of whether the DCC is effectively enforcing youth advertising and marketing restrictions. And frankly, the findings in that audit were not terribly complimentary to the DCC. Now, I will note the author, Assemblymember Jackie Irwin, has been focused on this issue for several years, and this audit report really gave her the traction she needed. Her previous bill, AB 1207, was strongly opposed by the industry and was ultimately vetoed by Governor Newsom in 2023 because the definition of attractive to children was viewed as overly broad and subjective. Unfortunately, as a result of the unflattering audit report and based upon the tenor of the hearing that occurred, it really became clear that the legislature was going to act in this space. So this was reaffirmed during Director Kellum's Senate confirmation hearing, actually after the audit committee hearing. Nearly every question was focused on, youth marketing and advertising. So really what we looked at as CaCOA and frankly the broader industry was this isn't really a question about whether something's going to happen. The question really became how much can we influence the final product in a way that doesn't completely upend the legal industry, which is frankly what AB 1207, the prior bill, would have done. So we tried to be very, very proactive. We released a white paper, The Packaging Problem, in February, and began engaging with the author's office very early, and those efforts really paid off. And I think something that's really important for viewers and listeners to understand is that the bill being discussed today looks very different than some of the concepts that were originally on the table. So for instance, and I'm covering this in detail, I apologize, but again, it's been my world for a number of months. So really through several months of engagement, CaCOA was able to secure significant improvements to the bill. So one of the biggest involved human imagery. So the early proposal basically said you couldn't use humans on any cannabis packaging, labeling, or advertising unless they were intended to convey safety information only. Well, the consequence of that is it would have swept in everything from founder imagery to adult lifestyle, branding, impacting every brand and product in the state. So with our amendments, we were able to negotiate, and the conversation ultimately shifted away from a blanket prohibition towards a more targeted approach focused on youth appeal only. So in other words, we can now use human imagery, provided that those humans aren't directly humans that one would determine or assess are primarily people that are used to market to kids. So Hannah Montana might be an example. So I'll wrap this up by saying whether one agrees with every aspect of the bill, it's a substantial improvement. We also were able to ward off other things that could have gone into the bill. So there was originally an idea about banning robots, banning spaceships, banning any and all vehicles, kinetic imagery. We were able to keep that out of the bill or negotiate it out of the bill. So what's left are some concerns around a prohibition around mythical creatures and some restrictions around the use of fruits and vegetables. But by and large, it is a substantially improved bill, and I'm extremely proud of CaCOA and our board. If we hadn't been in the room, the bill would look very different than it does today.
If you're a California cannabis operator who's developing new products all the time, is there going to be or is there a process where you can submit branding and marketing.
Yes. So that was something that we had added to the bill. It was a recommendation that came out of the packaging problem white paper. And what the bill says is that if you are an operator and you have designed some packaging or labeling or branding that might be a little bit of a tweener, or you have some potential concerns about it, you can set up a meeting with the DCC and go through a pre-approval process. And one other thing I also want to mention too is that I think is really important is we also negotiated a 1-year off ramp. So assuming the bill is signed and takes effect January 1, 2027, if you have an existing product that may fall within the prohibitions of the bill, you have 1 year to exhaust that and adjust your packaging and labeling to meet the requirements of the bill.
Well, and so how does that relate to AB 2532?
It does. It does. Well, it's the same author, Jackie Irwin, and 2532 really relates to cannabis infused beverages, which was something that the state auditor's report identified as being problematic as part of their investigation around advertising to minors. They found not only were a substantial number of infused beverages kind of falling within that gray area of maybe being marketed to children, but they were really, really concerned about serving size and felt that 100 milligrams or anything in excess of 10 milligrams, which constitutes a serving, needed to actually conform with the 10 milligram threshold. So nothing above 10 milligrams per can or bottle. And as we know,
Even for medical?
I don't remember if they made that distinction. That's a good question. I don't know if they made the distinction. I think they just generally found that a bottle that or can that exceeded the 10 milligrams was highly problematic from a consumer education disclosure standpoint. A lot of the bottles and cans that they examined didn't have really ways in which, at least this is what was argued, to measure 10 milligrams. There was concerns about carbonation in these beverages, their shelf life. And there were some general assumptions that if you buy and consume a can, you're going to drink it in one serving, and 100 milligrams was deemed highly inappropriate in this audit. And there were some collective gasps in the room. This came up quite a bit during that hearing, which was a bit surprising. So anyway, 2532 was introduced to address those concerns. And much like with 2249, the bill has been substantially improved due to the very aggressive early engagement with the author's office. So right now, the bill is amended, requires cannabis beverage labels to include the National Poison Control Helpline. It's a 1-800 number, which is consistent with broader public health messaging. So nobody disputed including that on bottles or cans. But the most significant change is that the bill as introduced would have limited all bottles and cans to 10 milligrams per serving or per bottle or can. And what we were able to negotiate, and this is largely due to the work of the infused beverage community, and we backed them up, is that now you can produce a beverage and have more than 10 milligrams per serving in that beverage, but you have to do one of two things. Either you have to have a clear, transparent, placement on the bottle that shows with lines that shows when a consumer's consumed 10 milligrams, or a retailer will have to offer, and this would be at the expense of the producer, some sort of measuring device. So the producer of these products will provide that to the retailer, and the retailer has to offer that to the consumer. So that would allow for the continued use of cans, because you can't do that transparent strip down the side of a can. So again, it really demonstrates what can happen when stakeholders proactively engage. Early discussions centered on whether, certain beverage formats should continue to exist at all was something that we were able to successfully make the case for. So the bill is moving with those amendments. It's enjoying support from the legal industry. And again, another early successful win while the bill was still in the assembly and now goes to the Senate.
So that's cool. Well, so okay, AB 25.
So CaCOA continues to be the lone opposition to that bill, which has been somewhat of a surprise. Although the bill has improved substantially thanks to CaCOA's opposition, we were able to negotiate some amendments. So just to refresh people's memories or get folks up to speed, 2506, I think I said the last time we spoke that it was probably the most consequential bill for the industry because it essentially would have set up a separate framework allowing tribal licensees to engage in commercial cannabis activity with state licensees if tribal regulatory systems met or exceeded certain thresholds. So they would have to meet and exceed our testing standards, meet and exceed inspections, meet and exceed different enforcement and compliance components. The problem with that is tribes are sovereign nations. So really the meet and exceed threshold would have been negotiated at the front end, but there would be no opportunity for the DCC to continue to inspect and ensure that tribal governments were complying with what they negotiated with the state. So we were very concerned about that. So ultimately, we took a respectful opposition position. Again, not because we oppose tribal participation in California's legal market, quite the opposite. But our concern really was one that the bill created a new and largely separate commercial framework before many of those foundational questions could be resolved. So, for instance, taxation was not on the table. So, theoretically, tribes wouldn't have to levy taxes. There was an example of a tribe that very openly said, "Oh, yeah, we already have cannabis on our tribal lands and dispensaries, and we serve alcohol and we serve food and we do all the things that you can't do." So, parity was really a concern. So since then, the bill's undergone substantial amendments and it's much improved the bill. So rather than creating a standalone tribal commerce framework, the current version incorporates basically tribal commerce agreements into California's existing interstate cannabis commerce framework, which we established several years ago under a bill, SB 1326. So and the short, I think, more simplistic way to describe this is we basically just added tribal governments to our interstate commerce statutes. So if and when the state feels we can lawfully participate in interstate commerce and negotiate agreements with other states, that same standard would apply to tribal governments. So again, bill is significantly improved. That said, the reason we continue to remain respectfully opposed is that there's still a lot of important questions surrounding regulatory parity, enforcement consistency, again, taxation, which I already brought up. And given the fragile condition of California's regulated cannabis market, our board was not comfortable supporting the introduction of additional cross-jurisdictional commerce before those issues are fully resolved. Really, too, as I think about federal rescheduling, this bill becomes increasingly more interesting.
I was just thinking, yeah.
Having all these broader conversations around rescheduling interstate commerce and national cannabis markets, as they continue to evolve. 2506 may ultimately serve as an early policy model for how California approaches those questions around regulatory equivalency or cross-jurisdictional enforcement. I mean, I think all those things are now kind of front and center. So again, whether one supports or opposes the bill today, it's certainly a conversation worth paying attention to because many of these questions are being debated in real time with, again, federal rescheduling now.
So now that we're past the House of Origin, what comes next?
House of Origin was a major milestone, but it's not the finish line. We're like now a little more than halfway there. Bills now move to the opposite house where they start the process all over again. So the only reason I say a little more than halfway there is, you've got earlier in the year, you've got like the bill introduction timeline and bills sit for 30 days. Everything passed off the floor by Thursday of last week, and now they're already getting referred to the Senate. So it's a little bit more rapid fire than what you see earlier in the year. So we're going to start everything over again. So I've already reached out to policy committee staff where I presume a lot of these bills are going to get referred. And so they'll receive new committee hearings, new analyses, new fiscal, new amendments. So for the cannabis industry, I think the key questions moving forward are whether California continues leaning into enforcement, how we ultimately resolve packaging and youth advertising standards, and really whether our legislators and more broadly policymakers can continue refining our regulatory system without creating new burdens that make it harder for licensed operators to compete. So again, just a repeat of the prior process, a little faster. Legislature will wrap up its work August 31st, if not a little earlier, although they never gavel down any earlier than midnight, usually, sometimes later. And then the governor will take days to act. Yeah. He'll have 30 days to act on bills following the legislature gaveling down on August 31st. There's also a month-long summer recess. So again, it's really, while we're going to go through the same policy and fiscal process, it's really, again, a quite accelerated timeline. So that house of origin that we talked about is really, again, where you try to flush out as much of the policy and address concerns as possible. And then you get to the other house. And I should note that the other house can be sometimes a little bit more hostile. You don't have the same, relationships. And so the committee deliberations can be a little bit more challenging.
Where do you see the industry? Where do you see it headed? What do you think are going to be kind of the next round of major challenges,
Mhm.
particularly based on what's going on legislatively these days?
Rescheduling has really dominated the conversation since the Trump administration released the executive order. And so when I think about things that we're not really contemplating in like California right now as a legislature and as a lobbyist for the industry, it's really what I think is on the horizon is how California contemplates changes to its current regulatory framework to allow operators to truly take advantage of rescheduling and the tax benefits associated with that. The reality is that California's medicinal and adult use cannabis systems were built for a very different legal environment. And as regulators and legislators begin implementing these changes, they're discovering that, or at least trying to implement these changes, there's so much uncertainty out there. I think what we're all collectively discovering is that many of the existing statutes and regulations may not actually align neatly with the new federal framework. So, for instance, CaCOA recently submitted comments to the DCC's emergency regulations, which allow one to very expeditiously change its A to designation and regulations. Or I'm not really describing that well. What it really does is it says if you are an A designated license holder, you can apply for through an expedited process apply for a second license on the same premises that is an M designation, but it would be essentially a separate and distinct LLC. And while we support the department's efforts, our public comment letter highlighted a number of practical challenges that could create, including supply chain bottlenecks and a limited ability for licensees to fully realize the benefits of rescheduling. One example of that is local control. So while the DCC may be able to very expeditiously issue an M designation on the same premises. As we well know, local governments they've established rules, they've established limits on the number of dispensaries, they have their own process. So is that really something that we can fully take advantage of? And does it really meet the spirit of rescheduling, which is really focused on that medicinal cannabis piece? So I think as I'm looking ahead, just in even just the next couple of months, federal reform may open the door, but California still has to make sure that the pathway through that door actually works. And so for these reasons, we are actually exploring, and we highlighted in our public comments, potential statutory changes that the DCC can't advance through regulation, but would have to be advanced through actual legislation. And with the legislature poised to gavel down at the end of August, we might be seeing some late legislation that really seeks to provide a better pathway for our industry in California to enjoy the benefits of rescheduling. But again, a lot of unknowns right now, but that's kind of how I see myself spending the next couple of months in addition to working through these other bills and any unresolved concerns.
Yeah, definitely more questions than answers. Is there any sense of where would the authority go? So
Mhm.
federal government waves its magic wand. Is it still the state running the show? Are the locals running the show? Are the are the feds running the show, or is it depending on what we're talking about?
Probably all of the above. I would say that the executive order really acknowledged and recognized that the states have that have established these robust, frameworks. I mean, there's a lot of deference to the states, but then again, the rescheduling also focuses exclusively on medicinal. So again, we're trying to think creatively to ensure that our heavily regulated comprehensive framework actually fits within that construct. And so again, it's whether we can empower through changes to statute, we can empower our retailers to conduct, attestations with, their customers to where the customer can say, yes, I'm using this for medical purposes. So we kind of empower dispensary operators, whether we have to change some of our labeling and disclosure requirements. So right now, if you'll recall, you look at a cannabis product, we have clear disclosures on our products that say this is a Schedule 1 drug. So I think, we're saying maybe we take that off and just say this is a controlled substance. So just really trying to think through how we meet the parameters of rescheduling while also understanding that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and the public hearing process commences later this month. So we'll adjust and pivot accordingly. But that's going back to your original question. I got a little long-winded here. I think the state, the feds, and the locals will certainly need to be part of that discussion as things evolve. And we'll probably all have a very separate and distinct role in implementing rescheduling in a way that benefits California operators, at least I hope. No, you raise a really interesting question because on the registration, so if an operator chooses to register, one of the questions, I think it's very early in the registration process, is are you going to continue to sell Schedule 1, narcotics or Schedule 1 marijuana? And I would imagine that most, if not every operator that registers is going to have to check yes on that box. And so that, I think there's a lot of broader questions. Is that subject our cannabis operators to undue exposure by checking that box? And we really don't know. We really don't know the answer to that yet. So just a lot of speculation and questions. It's interesting, even speaking to the Department of Cannabis Control and Director Kellum, they don't know. There's been very little engagement with the regulators that are overseeing these frameworks, not just in California, but in all the states. In fact, from what I understand, the DEA regional person, I think he represents or covers all of like the West Coast, like Western states. From what I understand, he's the only regional enforcement officer who's been willing to speak to the cannabis regulators, and but really doesn't know ultimately how this is going to be implemented. So it's difficult to opine at this point. There's a lot more questions than answers, and I'm quite hopeful that the rulemaking process, which kicks off, I believe, on June 29th, will maybe provide a little bit more direction as to where the feds are going. We're also awaiting some guidance from the U.S. Department of Treasury as it relates to the tax benefits. So hopefully some of these questions will be answered as the process continues. A lot of the legal interpretation of the executive order suggests that there isn't a clear path for interstate commerce, even with rescheduling. Even if we're recognized as medicinal, the executive order references international, but there's no clear path for intrastate. And so I think that's a fundamental question that's going to need to be asked and contemplated as part of this rulemaking process, because it really is silent on, again, whether or not, registrants that are approved by the DEA upon completion of the registration process. And again, it says that'll be completed in 6 months. When we talked to the DEA representative, he questioned how much staff would be available to even process some of these registrations. So again, it's really difficult to know, but a lack of clarity around interstate commerce is a big discussion point. I think I will just close by really just saying, again, we are approaching the 10-year anniversary of Prop 64, and just want to, as difficult as it has been, and I have to acknowledge the real difficulty of this transition, a lot of bumps and a lot of, and again, the market's very fragile. But all said, it's really exciting to feel, and I feel it every day as I'm lobbying, that we've really moved so beyond the legalization debate. And there's such investment in the legislature. I know it may not feel like that all the time, but there's such an investment by the legislature in helping to build a cannabis marketplace that works both for consumers, for regulators, and most importantly, from where I sit, for licensed operators. So, whether we're talking about enforcement, packaging and labeling, tribal commerce, federal rescheduling, I think, at least again, from my perspective, we share a goal with the vast majority of this legislature that is committed to ensuring the regulated market can compete and succeed. And I really believe that when I talk to them. The question is how we get there and what latitude do they have to advance comprehensive changes that really shape and support our industry and really prepare it to thrive, particularly in the era of rescheduling. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. Well, and that's a great segue too, because a lot of that success is dependent on us being able to connect legislators with operators in their districts, preferably, right?
it.
At least in the general area, but the constituent is always much better. Talk about why operators should join CaCOA and like why now is actually a really great time in the calendar to do so.
I appreciate that question. Well, I will just say that the industry has struggled, and maintaining a diverse membership that can support and fund this work has been challenging. It's been challenging for all the associations. While CaCOA is currently the largest, again, we struggle, and there frankly are not enough licensed operators that choose to get involved. And I cannot do this work. CaCOA can't do this work without the support of the industry. And what we have achieved just since the legislature started session in January has been phenomenal. And actually, even before that, so our association is relatively new. We launched officially in 2025. And in that time, we developed a comprehensive framework for intoxicating hemp. We were able to roll back the cannabis tax increase from 19 back to 15. All of that we achieved with very, very limited resources. But I know for a fact that we would be more successful if we had a more robust membership. I do the work of if you look at traditional trade associations, they have multiple lobbyists, multiple staff, all trying to, achieve the same objectives for the industries they represent. And we're, myself, you part-time, we've got a part-time admin. I'm not even a full-time ED. So it would be fantastic if more operators would recognize the importance of the association and what we do, and join, because the more resources we have, the more we can achieve on behalf of the entire industry. So please join CaCOA.
Hey, awesome. Well, for anyone listening or watching, they can go to cacoa.org. That's CACOA.org to sign up and learn more. But Amy, thank you as always. It's always such a pleasure to get to chat and talk cannabis. And yeah, see you next time.
See you soon.